Hello and welcome to the No Holds Barred Witchcraft podcast. Now, you know the Christians say, "What would Jesus do?" And they've got those little arm bracelets and all that sort of thing that the gift shops like to sell. Well, I've come up with a new one, Chris. It's WWSCU. Do you know what that stands
It would
for?
say, what would Cunningham use?
Yes, Scott Cunningham, the Messiah of
Oh,
Wicca.
you've stolen it. How dare you?
The Messiah of Wicca. You came up with that one, but obviously the only people that can really prove that's our patrons, and you don't want to listen to them. They like to think they know what goes on behind the scenes, but they don't. Anyway, so today we're all going to tackle the subject of magical correspondences. So when you get these Scott Cunningham books and they say, use this, rosemary, for
Everything.
protection, or everything, yeah. That's the Pinterest, I think, isn't it? The Pinterest tells you to use rosemary for everything, or use the plain quartz crystal for anything, or use the rose quartz for love, or use a what I don't know, but it's just one of those things. Okay, so let's get to the bottom of this. Do you need a magical book of correspondences for magic? Is it necessary at all?
No. Sorry, was I supposed to
No.
expand on that?
Do, Now, do you think that if you're gonna use herbs for medicine, do you think that you might need one then?
Yes, I think it's probably a good idea if you are going to attempt to take something medicinally. That one, you should consult a doctor or a herbalist, and secondly, you should make sure you definitely know what you are using. So the safest way to do that is obviously to buy it from a herbalist in its raw state, as opposed to necessarily growing it yourself. Although we do.
Yes. Mainly just because of obviously potency, and you're not entirely sure about the potency and things. There are ways around it, as Lady Poison would probably explain. The whole tincture method is quite a good way of making a standard kind of potency for formulas and things like that. We'll try and get her on at some point to talk about potions making and top secret Welsh witchcraft, but obviously we're still working on that. So anyway, so basically, from my perspective, and tell me if you agree or disagree, these books with correspondences and stuff like that might be interesting from the perspective of giving people
Ideas.
ideas, yeah, and inspiration that they can then go and research. But ultimately, what I see as pointless is if you're going to start working with herbs and you're going to start working with them medicinally, you'll need a herbal,
Yeah.
yeah? So why not, instead of buying the crappy Scott Cunningham book, buy a herbal which gives you more information about the history, is normally a little bit more accurate, and there's some scientific stuff in there that you might also find
Yeah,
interesting. Get a herbal, not a spell
and
book.
traditional uses, things like, from a historical point of view, what would the Romans have used it for? What would the Egyptians have used it for? Is there some kind of correlation? Obviously, the plant will have changed over those hundreds of years, and therefore it's probably a good idea for you to get acquainted with said herb. But at the end of the day, like, you will get a much more rounded understanding of what the capabilities are from a herbal perspective, then might give you some extra insight into how you would use that magically.
Yeah. So basically, think of our little lovely friend Nettle. So Nettle in the UK, stinging nettles, you probably think that they're everywhere. The Romans, I think, brought them over here and they like to flog each other with them. There's a story in that, for example. You could go and do your own research on it. In fact, I highly suggest you do because we're not going to spoil it for you. But things like stinging nettles, stuff like that, they're so abundantly in your local area that you could start using them in magical practice, blah, blah, blah. And medicinally as well, because they're great for making medicines with, for certain things.
Obviously,
But
be
if you
careful
take
where you're
that,
getting
if
them
you,
from. I would,
yeah,
if
if you don't
if a
want
dog can cock its
a dog
if a
sitting on
dog
it,
can cock its leg, you've harvested it from higher.
yeah, you're probably going to be taking either the new leaves at the top, you know, or you're going to be using the seeds. So basically, you can look all of that up. Um, But it is one of those things that grows everywhere. If you looked that up in a Scott Cunningham book, it's going to say something stupid like nettle equals protection. Right, okay, that's really, really helpful. So if it's a book, it should either give you fairly decent information or it should just not even bother to publish information about it in the first place. Now, obviously, from an animism perspective, so as in dealing with the plant spirit and learning from the plant itself, that is one of those things that people either go with that theory, have experience with that, or they don't at all. So if you're of the mind where you want to go more scientific, then the chances are you'd probably get on better with a herbal when it deals with researching herbal ingredients and stuff, not these stupid Pinterest posts where they say, here's the magical uses of rose quartz or rosemary. Whereas if you're one of those people that tends to go through the more psychic routes, the more kind of right side of the brain maybe, then you might want to study rosemary in the wild, you might want to start collecting some, you might want to try and feel for the energy and that sort of thing, because that's how you explore. Much like how children explore, babies explore, they put things in their mouth and stuff like that. Well, obviously psychics often, when they're getting on their kind of spell casting and stuff for the first time, I think from what I've seen is they tend to want to feel the ingredients out, get a feel for them. They don't really want to start looking loads of stuff up in the book, do they?
No. At the end of the day, like, why would you want to necessarily use exotic ingredients that aren't grown locally? You can't actually get a feel for how they are. Yeah, don't get me wrong, there will always be moments where you're like, okay, for what I want to do, nothing's going to work better than frankincense. Like, but you know what I mean? Like, but there'll be those exceptions to the rule. Your general work surely can be environmental. You have a better understanding of that if it grows in your environment. You have more in common with it if it grows in your environment. So if you're doing spellcrafting work that works directly with you as an individual, surely your understanding of where that is, the triggers of, going back to how you would sense it, is taste, smell, places you will have seen it, memories from when it was used, or moments that might have been used growing up. You're going to have more of a relationship with something that grows locally, like nettle, for example, than if you were going to get a random item because the Scott Cunningham book told you to use it. So if you've never worked with wormwood, for example, why would you put it in something that you are hoping to know what results you are going to get from a spell working? Because surely when you're designing your spell, you're going to build it in a way that you know it's going to get you the result. Otherwise, what's the point of casting in the first place? There is that part of, well, if you're formulating what's going into it, you need to understand why that item is going into that mixture, not just because certain author has said it's good. Because, largely it's going to be a case of, actually, do you have an understanding of what's going to happen if you don't know the ingredients?
Yeah, and it's just going back to that kind of cookery book idea of spellcasting of here's a list of ingredients and here's the method. I'm not going to explain it, but you're just going to go and copy it or try and copy it. Where does this thing come from with the correspondences? I just don't really get it. When did we stop
Thinking.
having a relationship and thinking about the ingredients and about the practice and throwing ourselves into it? And when did we start going down this kind of recipe book approach?
I imagine it.
What are your thoughts? Because I've got some strong thoughts.
Well, I imagine.
I want to hear yours.
I imagine it's the resurgence of witchcraft during the 50s onwards is going to be a large part of it. Is going to be where
you're blaming it on the Wiccans.
Well, not necessarily the Wiccans, but more the case of the
blaming it on the Cochranites.
No, the readily availability of printed works about witchcraft. So they're not going to happen until the 50s, are they? For what reason, Liam?
Oh, the repeal of the Witchcraft Act in Britain, of
Of
course.
course. So therefore,
That's when it all went wrong.
from that point, you're then going to, it's not a case of, oh, I'm going to use grandma's, collection of recipes, because it wouldn't have been a grimoire or a book of shadows. We didn't call them then. Um, it was being a case of, it would have been in her secret book of recipes, her little black book, um, that she would have handed down from her mother and her grandmother, etc. So, it was secret knowledge being handed down bloodlines as opposed to necessarily being able to go to a local bookshop and buying it like you can the works of Shakespeare. Like, it's at that point, it's so readily available, the printed word, that it's only gone downhill from there. So, obviously what sells gets reprinted and recast like Shakespeare. They get something that's popular and then everybody bastardizes it over and over again. So the biggest problem with that is the fact that the likes of Scott Cunningham were the ones that were popular at the time. Um, Unfortunately, we're now still reaping the rewards of it. When it's a case of, actually, why would you? Just why would you do what, WWSCU?
Why would you do what Scott Cunningham does or says to use?
By all means.
Now, here's some food for thought, right?
Okay.
If the Witchcraft Act was never repealed, and it was still, say, illegal to practice witchcraft in the UK now, this show would be on the dark web, wouldn't it? It'd be on the deep web,
It would.
right? On some sort of weird kind of thing. We'd be getting our Patreons through all the Bitcoin and all that.
Yep.
Kind of like Silk Road and where you go and buy drugs online, that sort of thing. You'd be buying your drugs, and you'd also be buying your next episode of the No Holds Barred Witchcraft podcast. Yep. Imagine what that show would be like.
Oh, God.
Not just from the perspective of, obviously, we try to censor ourselves and be polite and stuff. Yeah, actually we do, so don't shake your heads. We do try and censor ourselves and be polite on the main, at least the mainstream podcast. But also think of practice. There would be none of this Pinterest crap.
No.
There would be none of these books coming out. The magical world would be full of people that, if it was known what they were practicing, they would have been arrested, or they would be arrested and stuff. Yep. That means that it would be underground, which means that it would only be really serious seekers and practitioners that would be about. Imagine how much more interesting magical practice would be. You wouldn't be having to read through a pile of shit just to get a couple of golden nuggets.
Yeah.
I do often think
you also
about
wouldn't be using rose quartz and the likes of things like that, because they wouldn't be so readily available, because the new age wouldn't have happened. So it wouldn't have become popular currency in order to use these sorts of items. So you probably would only be using what was available in your environment, or what you could get hold of in other ways, I guess. Even to a certain extent, you'd probably, in the UK, I don't know about the rest of the world because I can't speak for them, but in the UK, maybe we'd be using more Chinese ingredients, because a Chinese herbalist would be an easy place to get hold of strange and wonderful things. Because I remember in my young days, when I couldn't find something because there was no decent witchcraft shops about, it would be what was available in the supermarket and what was available at the Chinese herbalist if I wanted to be ambitious.
Yeah. How many of you have gone in a Chinese herbalist looking for magical herbs and ingredients and stuff like that? No, you just go to the spice rack at Asda, don't you? Or Waitrose if you're, middle class. No, I mean, some of you people might be going out and bumping into other magical practitioners at the crossroads at night. You might bump into old Lady Poison down at the crossroads with her stang pointing it at the old folk devil, making him do her bidding. Instead of on your Facebook groups, like the one that we made, you know? Imagine that. Obviously, we might not all be friends in a community, but we probably either would be on the astral, or we would be mixing probably more with local
Yeah.
practitioners. Because that's the thing, when you meet local practitioners, more often than not, it's not online, it's bumping into them at sacred sites, at various different places, because these places of power tend to attract our sort, like magpies,
Yeah.
don't they? And it's a lot like dogs, in it. You know when there's another dog about. A dog knows when there's another dog about. A witch knows when there's another witch around the
Yeah, they're
corner,
always pissing everywhere, aren't they?
Yeah, marking their territory. Or are you just talking about the the Wiccans, the older generation of Wiccans that are in the care homes and they're pissing themselves because they're incontinent?
Oh, poor guys.
The ones that wrote the books in the 80s and 90s, the incontinent Wiccans, they went from being incompetent to incontinent.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Well, you set that one up. I mean,
Unintentionally, I will add. But no, I think
magical
the
correspondences.
the world would be very different. You have got a point. The question is whether or not you'd want that. I don't know. Does the bad balance out the good? I don't know. I'm not going to go down there because it will end up in another tangent. But I don't understand why people expect to. Well, maybe that's the problem. I wonder why people think they're going to progress in their practice by sticking to what books say. So I struggle with that. But then am I giving too much credit, and actually it's not about progression, it's about doing the work? Is that the difference?
I think that it's a case of if you're learned and spoon-fed from a book that's structured and there's a curriculum, you never ever develop the ability to solve your own problems or create your aims and goals because the book tells you what techniques you're supposed to do. The book tells you to a certain extent the result you're supposed to get, and it all comes from that. You're never really, having to really think and aim yourself. And obviously, that book will be biased in that it will be created by someone that's on a path. Unfortunately, the current popular path is Wicca, although it's moving into traditional witchcraft. I mean post Kelden traditional witchcraft. Do we need to go off on that one?
PKTW.
That might be that might be a podcast all in
I
its
think it
own.
will be. But it is that kind of, where even to a certain extent, the only comment I will make on that front is that kind of, by switching it from a circle to a compass, doesn't therefore make it anywhere better. It's still using a circle. So, if you've never got to the point where you have learned what the circle is supposed to represent and how it doesn't physically need to be drawn anywhere, then obviously we need to get you some new books to read, or sign you up for one of our courses. Um, but that's all I'm going to say about that, because I think we could totally do a complete episode, if not two, on the PKTWs. But go on.
Okay, so we're mainly talking about correspondences apart from the tangents that I've even already forgotten what we went off on tangents about. I don't know. The only thing that springs to mind is Lady Poison poking the folk devil with a stang, but there we go. Um, see, how do you teach how to use the ingredients of a spell? What's the method? Because I think we both teach the same way. It just also depends. The only extra input that would change would be the actual student themselves, wouldn't it?
Yeah, yeah. So for me, I'd still teach and pretty much always taught the kind of intuitive method. So it would be a case of going out, getting them to go for a walk with a specific focus or spell in mind, and gather the ingredients that speak to them at the time. So, or it's a case of if you're just teaching kind of herbology, as opposed to actually having a spell in mind, then it would be a case of going for walks, seeing what jumps out, collecting some, speaking to, I use the term speaking very loosely, to the honor in the spirit that is within whatever, tree or plant or whatever, from an animistic point of view, and then taking some of that home and making that revisit part of the learning with that particular ingredient in mind. So, we're going on herbal because it's the one that makes the most sense to kind of explain this method. But essentially is you've got a small amount of it at home that allows you to connect to it remotely and learn more and more about it as you go. You then make part of that, going back to the spot where you took it, a regular part of your kind of understanding, and obviously you will learn more and more as you interact with it. You'll learn its personality, what's different about it. Yes, from an animistic point of view, you'd basically say all rosemary is connected wherever it is in the world, but it doesn't mean that they don't have, a nation of people aren't all the same. So, there is that individual parts of them are going to react
Wait,
different.
wait. You mean that middle-aged white men aren't all the same?
Not technically, no.
Oh, well, one of the people that posted in the No Holds Barred Witchcraft. No, it wasn't that. Of course, it wouldn't be one of ours in the No Holds Barred Witchcraft Facebook group. The Solitary Witchcraft Facebook group, when I wrote a load of stuff about, what was it? Was it the Hermanubis
I think
one? I
probably.
think it was Hermanubis article about obviously spirits and dissecting them and seeing what they do. Someone just decided not to bother to read anything I wrote and just wrote a massive comment about, ugh, middle-aged white men, they're all the same and they're all evil. I thought, wow, this is very strange. And it was the only comment that that article had. Anyway, sorry, I don't want to, don't want to go off on a tangent again. It just popped in my head.
Okay. So,
Um, we have a client at the
so
moment that's
Liam has
going through
Tourette's.
this.
Carry on.
We have a client that's going through this that's looking a little bit more about herbals, someone that we're helping mentor through Patreon. For those that don't know, obviously on the Patreon, when we meet people and discuss their kind of paths and stuff like that, it can be a little bit overwhelming. So we like to make video notes, and then anyone can see the video notes, but obviously it's anonymous as to who the video notes are. There's one on there at the moment, Patron Paths 2, which is the soul of plants and humans, which goes through this process of, basically the kind of mini homework and stuff I set for this specific person. But it's a case of obviously with herbal, you're choosing going down the scientific medicinal kind of route, or you're going down the magical route. And actually, when it gets down to it, there is no real one or the other. If you start on one path, you'll merge into the other. That's the thing. So it's really where you're going to start. Normally, I recommend starting with the intuition and the magical path, just so that what we tend to find, I think, is that when they start getting all of these impressions from these plants and stuff like that, and then they look at the scientific and medicinal attributes of the plants and the growth and, environment and stuff like that, the things that the plant's about and the effects, then you find that there's a lot of correlation between the psychic imagery and the information that comes. And that's a very magical kind of process. You don't necessarily get that with the other way round,
No.
So that's why we start the magical, intuitive based stuff.
Yeah, because to a certain extent, if you go the other route, you're not actually looking at a set of correspondences, but you are looking at through a very specific lens. So when you're looking through from a medical point of view, you are looking at a problem solution kind of relationship, whereas actually magic doesn't necessarily work in that way and has to find more creative solutions to the problem in varying combinations. So by approaching it from the magical point of view, you'll still get to a certain extent to the same point either route. It's just from we find from an intuitive point of view, you will find those connections quicker, because they're not forced or taught to you. It is a case of you are experiencing and learning them. When you go from a medical point of view, there are prescribed answers, Whereas actually from the intuitive methods, you're actually learning those as they come to you. It is natural and creative, and therefore there is going to be no right or wrong answer necessarily to them. There is going to be your answer and somebody else's answer. They may, line up beautifully because that's the way the universe tends to work. But the point is how you got there and what you learned from it is in some ways a lot more fruitful that way round.
Do you think that there's kind of snobbery to a certain extent when it comes to ingredients within spellcasting? Because I know there certainly is when it comes to the methods of creating certain things, like magical oils. We sell basically two forms of magical oils. They both do the same thing, but they're constructed in different ways. One's essential oil based, and one's picking and brewing the plants.
Yeah.
More hoodoo, traditional witchcraft style way of doing it, or herbal way of doing it. And you'll get the people that's like, oh, no, don't use essential oils for that. That's not going to be very potent magically. And then you've got the other kind of method of, well, why are you doing it that way, where you're going and picking the plants and brewing them for X amount of time? That's going to take too long. Why are you dealing with all of that?
Yeah.
And actually, it's like, to a certain extent, it's snobbery, because both of them will do the same thing. If you got a money drawing oil and one's constructed via essential oils and one's constructed via other means, traditional brew method, both of them will draw that money, but the mechanisms behind how the brew works are actually different. And if you're wondering, certainly on the website and stuff, why we sell different ones, because obviously we make both of those. So we do the hoodoo style ones, the traditional witchcrafty ones, but we also do the little ones that are like poppers and stuff. Well, the reason is because obviously we teach all of this. So when you teach a brewing class and stuff, you're not going to teach one method. You're going to compare and contrast brewing methods. So what about magical snobbery and approaches? Because we can be guilty of that maybe every now and then. But what are your thoughts on that, Chris?
Most of our snobbery, though, comes from the source, though, doesn't it? It's the case of, well, actually, where have you heard that? Like, if it's a case of you've turned around and can actually go, actually, no, I came up with this because of this, this, and this, and my personal experience, blah, then that's valid. That is a valid answer to give. So, for me, I don't tend to have qualms with what people use. What I tend to have is when asked about it, and I find this is where people get uppity about it, is they're not used to being cross-examined as to why they have used something, and therefore they assume that you have some kind of ill intent in order to, you're trying to catch them out or whatever. Whereas actually, in the job role that we have, we're constantly learning new things about people by their choices. That's the best way to kind of learn anything about them. So if they've got an obvious answer for why they've always used that item, like I probably overuse rosemary, and it's not because of some meme or because of some book by John Cunningham. Who's John? By Scott Cunningham.
John Cunningham was maybe like his older brother that he stole all the correspondences from. I imagine John Cunningham could have been like this actual proper hardcore traditional witch who used to like journal and make notes, and then Scott Cunningham, the idiot younger brother who didn't actually know anything, stole the notebook and copied it out, and then that's where you get Wicca.
Maybe.
I don't know if that's true, but it's probably not.
Now I've lost my thread.
Should we move on?
No, I probably had something really interesting. I probably had something really interesting to say, but you had to go off with one of your random, let's pick on Scott Cunningham situations.
Yeah, but Lauren likes it when we go on tangents and when I make you squirm. I'll rewind a little bit. So basically, you're talking about these people that are in the Facebook groups, and they'll write, "I did such and such, and I used this," and then you ask them, "Well, why did you use that?" And then they jump in, it's like, "Oh, why are you being mean? I can use it that way."
Yeah.
Right, well, it doesn't matter because we are out of time. So if you want to know more, you're just going to have to go on the Patreon.